Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Alan Lusk, and I'm a tech committee person with the Friends of Hagerman board and a fan of the Second Saturday programs. If you're not already a member of the Friends of Hagerman, I'll post a link in the chat to our new website where you can become a member. That'll get you on the email list. You'll get a couple emails a month with what's going on there at the refuge. But it's good to have everyone today for our Second Saturday program. And I'm going to turn it over to Wayne Meyer and let him introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Alan. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tim Patton, who teaches at Southeastern Oklahoma State. He is in the wildlife department and is a specialist on all kinds of things, but we always tap him for fish. And so he's going to talk to us about Lake Texoma and some of the critters that live in it.
All right, thank you very much. So before I just jump into the talks here, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my experience here with Lake Texoma. I moved to this area, my family and I moved to this area in the late 90s from Wyoming. I worked as a wildlife research associate for an entity that was kind of a collaboration between state and federal agencies up there. And this was my first job in academia, never lived in this area before. And my intention was I would live here for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years and then go someplace else. And within 2 or 3 years, the job really grew on me. I liked it a lot. The area eventually grew on me. And to be honest, Lake Texoma is one of the reasons that the area really grew on me. I initially started experiencing Lake Texoma from a research perspective. From a teaching perspective, I teach limnology as one of the classes I teach. Limnology is the study of freshwater ecosystems. So lakes, streams, and wetlands. And then I started using Lake Texoma recreationally, hunting around on the core land, fishing, even though I'm not a very good fisherman. Eventually took up boating in various forms. I've had a couple of sailboats over the years, and I mountain bike, so I mountain bike around on Eisenhower, swimming. So the place really, the place grew on me again, largely because of Lake Texoma. And I think people are generally attracted to being around water. I think that's just sort of inherent in us. You know, aside from its life-sustaining properties, it provides us with all these aesthetic and recreational opportunities that give us a good quality of life. That said, these aquatic ecosystems, virtually all of them, are facing some sorts of threats, and Lake Texoma is no different. So I think all of our a greater understanding of these ecosystems is certainly going to give us more knowledge for which we can actually make management decisions and conserve these systems. All right, so with that, I'm going to jump right into it. I called this talk Ecology of Lake Texoma. I think I might have actually called it Fish Ecology of Lake Texoma on some of the things I submitted before. They all tie together. You can't really talk about fish ecology without talking about a lot of other stuff. You can't talk about physical properties of a lake without talking about how it affects the fish. So I'm going to kind of combine a bunch of things here. This is limnology, very much limnology that I'm going through today. So I picked 6 topics here that I'm going to go over. There's the list of them. I won't read them right now. We'll see this list as we go. So we're going to start with how our lakes formed. So in general, we can talk about lake classifications as forming in one of 2 or 3 ways. We can consider what we call catastrophic formation. These are lakes that happen very quickly as a result of some very dramatic geological event. This is Crater Lake in Oregon. I think everybody knows how that one was formed. It's actually a volcanic crater. This is Landslide Lake in Wyoming. This is the Grovant River runs through here. And this valley blew out some 150 years ago and deposited this dam and formed a lake behind it. This one down here is a meteor strike lake. Meteor strikes are called astrobleams, or the scars that they leave, and that's what this one is right here. And this one is as well. This one is also a meteor strike lake. It's kind of interesting that you know, sometimes they'll have land in the middle of them and form more like a ring like that. And this kind of shows you why, right? You guys can see my cursor, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. So if you've ever, like, for example, bounced a basketball in the sand, it usually doesn't leave a round depression like that. That compression rebounds and it leaves a bump in the middle. And that's why we tend to see these astrobleam lakes, sometimes forming a ring, and sometimes that bump is under the water, but it's still there. So obviously we don't have anything like that in our immediate area, but I think it's interesting to think about how natural lakes are formed. We also have lakes that are formed naturally through what we call gradual processes. Here are some examples of those types: glacial activities, glacial moraine lakes. For example, the Great Lakes are certainly an example of that, but also most of the high mountain lakes that you see in the Rockies are glacially formed. Tectonic activity can form lakes. Like, for example, this is the Great Rift Valley of Africa. And this is one giant fault. It's actually a double fault, or graben. And lakes actually form within that fault line where those tectonic plates come into contact with each other. This one right here is Lake Hattie in Wyoming, which I used to recreate in a lot. It sits right at the foot of the Snowy Range. And this one actually came about as a result of wind that was associated with the outset of the last ice age. So, you know, starting around 12 or 15,000 years ago, the winds coming off of the mountains up here were quite extreme, and they literally dished this out. That soil has actually been, it was later determined, forms the sand hills of Nebraska. So that's how far it pushed that stuff. And then a few other formations we have here. We can form lakes through what are called fluviatile processes, which means anything that's associated with a river process. So for example, over here you see some pictures of some oxbow lakes that are associated with this river. Those formed by when these rivers form a meander bend. And eventually, during a high flow event, that water can cut across the bottom of that meander bend and then leave the oxbow itself isolated. This is one of the few types of natural lakes that we have in Texas. Obviously, we don't have any tectonic or glacial lakes down here, but we do have a lot of oxbow lakes. We also have a lot of these aeolian wind force lakes as well. Most of the wind lakes that we have here in Texas are relatively small, and in West Texas, but we call these playa lakes. If you've ever been in West Texas, you see quite a few of those playa lakes as well. This one over here is an example of a coastal lake formation. This is where a tributary river ran into an ocean. So this was formerly a bay, but then if it can get a sediment plug through sand, which you see here, it can trap the fresh water behind it. And we also have a handful of lake formations that are caused by organisms. Like, for example, this is Bowler Lake in Oklahoma. I've done a fair bit of research on this one. It's formed by beavers. This one is a typical bison wallow pond. Those things formerly existed all over the Great Plains where bisons would wallow. Most of them were temporary. They were fantastic habitat for a lot of shore birds, migrating birds, waterfowl, amphibians. No doubt thrived in the Great Plains back when there were a lot of bison wallows. And then, of course, we have this species right here that is really good at building lakes. And of course, typically we would refer to those as reservoirs. So there's a good example of a reservoir. The one right here in our backyard is Lake Texoma, which is obviously built by humans. So when it comes to all these various kinds of lakes, as I mentioned before, if we have a greater understanding of these lakes, we can do a much better job in making management decisions and in conserving them. And so we have a variety of techniques that we can use to describe lakes. Let me go into that just a little bit here. We call that process morphometrics. So morpho means shape, and metrics is something that we can measure. So Morphometrics are basically describing the shapes of lakes in a quantitative way. So it's very objective. We can use it for communication. We can use it for management purposes and all kinds of things. So we could look at a lake from two-dimensional space, like just from the top. So surface morphometrics. That would include describing things like the shape of the surface features, the length of the lake, the width, how much area it has, how it's oriented. For example, the one you see there at the bottom would be an example of a lake that's fairly east-west oriented. Lake Texoma is largely east-west oriented. And we can also look at more of a three-dimensional perspective of subsurface morphometrics. So if you look at this one down here, you notice that it actually has contour intervals, much like a contour map. And that's exactly what it is. Of course, in this case, those contours represent a hole going down, not a mountain coming up. We refer to that as a bathymetric map. And that's how we start by understanding morphometrics in a lake, is building a bathymetric map. And then from that, we can calculate all kinds of things, determine all kinds of things, the depth, the average depth, where those areas of depth are. So for example, in this lake right here, you can see there's a lot of deep water at this dark blue end, very shallow up here at this end, and kind of intermediate here. You see how steep the banks are, relatively flat basin here. So a lot of things we can determine from that. We can calculate the volume of the lake and calculate the volume of the lake at different water levels. And if you've ever looked at the Corps of Engineers homepage describing Lake Texoma, you'll see a lot of these morphometrics that they use to describe it. So morphometrics of Lake Texoma. It's a relatively long lake. It's about 50 miles long from way up here where the Red River enters down here to the dam. That's following the river channel. It's roughly 50 miles or so. It's relatively narrow. The typical width on Lake Texoma is usually about 3 miles wide. It's relatively shallow. The average depth of Lake Texoma is about 40 feet. As I mentioned before, it has an east-west orientation. And as a result of that, it interacts very strongly with our predominant winds here. It's somewhat of a dendritic shape. Dendritic refers to branching or tree-like. Like for example, dendrology is the study of trees. And so you see how it's branching as a result of the fact that we basically built a dam in a river valley. And so all of those branches represent all the little tributary streams that fed into the river systems before we put the dam there. And of course, they still do feed into it, but water backs up into them. We have roughly 500, actually over 580 miles of shoreline, depending on the water level. I think the average is around 550 miles of shoreline if you measure the perimeter. And it's a somewhat riverine shaped lake. Because it's relatively long, it's relatively narrow, water actually moves through Lake Texoma at a pretty high rate. We measure what's called the turnover rate. And Lake Texoma actually has a fairly high turnover rate because it's a very riverine type of a lake. You know, as opposed to something like this one down here. This is Bear Lake in Utah. And you can see this is a very round-ish lake, much, much deeper. I think I read someplace that the turnover time in Bear Lake is something like 15 years or something like that. Whereas in Lake Texoma, it's really more like just months. So why do we do that? Again, this allows us to have a much greater understanding of that lake's ecology. It allows us to detect changes in that lake over time. And all of those just allow us to make more informed management decisions. Now you notice that this bit of a bathymetric map here is showing on the Oklahoma side. If you're familiar with it, this is Willow Springs area here. Here's Johnson Creek and Newberry Creek. This is Highway 70. So that's the Highway 70 bridge over the lake right there. This is where the Washita River runs in. And I've done a fair bit of work up here as it relates to sedimentation and how that sedimentation has affected fish communities. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is some work that I did. Oh gosh, this is I think we published this work in like 2005 or 2006. So this is work that I did 15 years ago, but this is, if you're familiar with the area, this is north dike that you see, this straight line right here. And this picture is from, these are from the NRCS at some different time intervals. So these are aerial photographs. And you can see we have one from these 4 time periods, 1969, 1983, 1991, and 2003. And these were about as close as I could get to the same scale and the same area that was repeated over time. So again, there's that North Dike Dam right here. You see it here, here, and here. So you see this picture is the one that's the most scaled out. So what we did is we were looking at the rate of sedimentation just based on the amount of sedimentation that's actually come up above the water surface. So reference this cove right here. This kind of a twin cove. That's called Widow Moore Cove. And you can see that back in '69, this was all open water. Now remember, the Washita River runs in right about here. If you bump over here to 1983, you see that this sediment bar has been deposited. This area right here is now completely isolated from the rest of the lake. And here's that Widow Moore Cove. Fast forward to 1991, and you'll notice that it's depositing the sediment in this direction now. You can actually see the sand plumes and the direction of the flow by the color of the water and where it's depositing the sediment. And then by 2003, here's that Widow Moore Cove. You see now it's completely isolated from the rest of the lake. These little bodies have become isolated, and in fact, even Cumberland Pool is now almost completely isolated except during high water events. And there is even more now. Again, this was 15 years ago, so we would see an even more dramatic change when we look at that now. That's a good example of the use of morphometrics, being able to monitor a lake over time and detect those kinds of changes. Now, let's step back a little bit. I know that seems like we have already stepped back. We're looking at aerial images. We're going to step back even further, because where is all that sediment coming from? In fact, where is everything in Lake Texoma coming from? The water, the sediment, the nutrients, potentially some of the impacts. Well, the short answer is from the watershed. So let's take a look at watersheds for a bit. A watershed, you might also hear it called a basin. Like, for example, we might refer to the Lake Texoma Basin. Over there on the right, you see, I just grabbed some images of the basins of the 3 largest, or I should say longest, river systems in the world. Here's the Amazon basin. You can see there's the main stem of the Amazon. And this line here represents all of the land and all of the tributaries that drain into the Amazon basin. Here's one for the Nile in Africa. And this one here is the Mississippi, obviously here in North America. So we define that as a basin or a watershed as the area of land draining to a given point on a river. Now, why do we say to a given point? Well, if I were interested, for example, in, let's say, this point of the river, you can see that this land does not drain into this point, but all of this land does drain into that point. So it's basically that point and everything upstream. So you can break these out into all of these different sub-basins as a result of that. So you probably notice when you look at the Mississippi basin there, it is color-coded into multiple sub-basins. All of those flow into the Mississippi, but you see this is the Ohio basin, the Upper Mississippi River Basin, the Missouri River Basin, the Arkansas White River Basin, and down here is the Red River Basin. Now, obviously, Lake Texoma is in the Red River Basin, but it does not include all of this. Lake Texoma sits about right here. So it only includes everything upstream from that given point on the river. So you can kind of see here then what the sub-basin is that drains into Lake Texoma. This is a couple of sort of zoomed in views of that. These are the Lake Texoma, the basin for Lake Texoma. And even that we can break into a whole bunch of different sub-basins. So down here you see sort of some line drawings of the major tributaries. Here's the Red River itself. And then all of those rivers and streams that feed into it. You know, up here in Oklahoma is the Beaver River and Cache Creek and North Fork of the Red River and the Salt Fork of the Red River. This is, I believe, the Prairie Dog Fork down here in Texas. So if you were to draw a polygon around those, like for example, if I drew a polygon around just this river basin right here, that's what this map up here is showing. So this allows us to kind of break down the watershed to understand where all of the input is coming into a river and eventually into a lake. So we could, for example, identify perhaps where most of the sediment is coming in, or where most of the nutrients are coming in. Where is water being removed? Where is water being added to the system? How is the vegetation managed in each of those basins? All of those things have a big impact on Lake Texoma. So there's a map of Lake Texoma, and it kind of gives you an idea when you start looking at all of those little tributary creeks, these coves, for example. These represent, you know, there's a Buncombe Creek basin up here someplace. And down here is the Big Mineral Basin. And over here is the Little Mineral Basin. So this one is zooming in a little bit more on some of the ones that feed more immediately into Lake Texoma. And of course, I'm sure everybody knows where Hagerman National Wildlife Refuge is. It's over here on the Big Mineral arm of Lake Texoma. So the Big Mineral Basin has a large impact on Hagerman National Wildlife Refuge. Okay, so we've kind of worked our way down here, understanding big picture, getting down here to the water itself. And so what I want to go into next is a kind of a quick overview of the fishes of Lake Texoma. This is not a comprehensive talk about the fishes of Lake Texoma. That's fodder for an entire talk in and of itself. In fact, I think I have one of those coming up pretty quick here for the Texas Master Naturalists. I'm giving a talk on ichthyology. I don't remember the date, but it's coming up this fall. So if anybody's interested in listening to a talk more specifically about just fish, that's what that one will focus on. So let me just kind of give you a quick overview of the fish in Lake Texoma, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what niches they fill, and I think that will help us further understand the lake. So we have a fairly high diversity in Lake Texoma, 16 different families of fish that have been identified, as many as 71 species. I want to point out that this is based on a paper that goes all the way back to 1959. Riggs did a survey of Lake Texoma, but he also sampled the tailwater. So in other words, he sampled the Red River just downstream of the lake. And that increased this number by quite a bit when you include the tailwaters. So the actual number in the lake is probably somewhere closer to about 50 species. Now, what fish would be in the lake? I just recognize this should say 3 broad groups, not 2 broad groups. Where did these fish come from? How did they get in the lake? Well, the first group is what we would call the river antecedents. These were just the fish that were already in the Red River system, in the Washita River system. We built a dam. They're trapped behind there. And that's what we mean when we say antecedents. Those were the things that were there before we ever built the system. Now, when we think about the sort of the niche or the types of fish that would be in the Red River, those are generally what we classify as big river fishes. In fact, when I teach ichthyology, the class, my fish identification is based on groups of fishes. So we learn about fishes that live in big rivers, and we learn about fishes that live in small creeks. We learn about fishes that live in wetlands and sloughs, and so on and so forth. We kind of break them out by habitat type. So the Red River has a lot of big river fishes. Some of those big river fishes do great when you put a dam in and they get trapped in a reservoir. Others do not. I'll show you some examples of both. In Lake Texoma, we can also find fish that we call the generalists. Generalists are the fish that frankly can live anywhere. They're kind of weedy species, you know, channel catfish, largemouth bass, green sunfish. There are a number of fish that they'll live in a farm pond, in a small creek, in a big river. They don't really care. They're very much generalists. So certainly we have plenty of those in Lake Texoma. In fact, many of those became more abundant when we built Lake Texoma because we took it away from a fairly specific big river habitat and turned it into a much more generalized habitat. And then third, we have a little handful of species that were stocked for various reasons, most of which were either for sport fishing or for what are called in general accidental or unintentional introductions. Now, I'm going to go through these relatively quickly because, again, this isn't really a fish identification talk. This is really more of an overview. So I'm starting, this will be in phylogenetic order, kind of going from the least derived to the most derived, or in other words, going from the most primitive fishes to the more advanced fishes. So we have up here the sturgeons, the family Acipenseridae. We have one sturgeon species that's native to the Red River Basin. It's the shovel-nosed sturgeon. They do not do well in a reservoir. This is a good example of a fish that likes big rivers, but when you put a dam in, not so much. They are still in the Red River below the dam, but I'm not aware of any being captured within Lake Texoma in a very, very long time. The same is true of paddlefish in Lake Texoma. It's a big river fish. Paddlefish are in Lake Texoma, but they have yet to reproduce naturally. All of the paddlefish that we have in Lake Texoma are of stocked origin. This is the family Anguillidae, the freshwater eels. These are also very rare in Texoma. I will hear about one popping up every now and then. This is actually a catadromous fish. So that means that it lives in freshwater and then spawns in salt water. So kind of the opposite of an anadromous fish like a salmon. So you can see that this fish has a long way to travel. So it's easy to understand why they're very, very rare in the lake. We have 4 species of gar in the lake, all of which are quite abundant. There's a short-nosed gar, a long-nosed gar, an alligator gar, and a spotted gar. All of these are big river fishes, and all of them do quite well when you build a reservoir. They still live in the river as well, but they do not mind the standing water of a reservoir. There's a family called Hyodontidae, which the more common name for the family is a bony tongue. You can see that this fish has a lot of really sharp teeth, including here on its tongue, and that's where they get the name. We have only one species of this family in Lake Texoma. It's the goldeye. I wouldn't call this a common fish, but I wouldn't call it a rare fish or uncommon, like the ones we saw on the previous slide. I'll frequently get these when I'm sampling in Lake Texoma. Very unique looking fish. At first glance, you might think it's a big shad, but as soon as you look at that head, you would recognize that it's not. The family Clupeidae includes the shads, the herrings, the menhadeds. It's mostly a marine family. So lots and lots of species of clupeids that live in the oceans, a little handful that live in freshwater. And we have 3 that live in Lake Texoma. 2 of those are very, very abundant. You see, this is the gizzard shad. This is the threadfin shad. And this one is a skipjack herring, which are very rare in Lake Texoma, but do pop up every once in a while. I think I've caught 1 or 2 in all of my sampling efforts in Lake Texoma. Now, I want to point something out about gizzard shad here that we're going to see play a pretty important role later. These 2 fish look a little bit alike, look a lot alike when they're small, but I want to point out that this one down here, a threadfin shad, is actually a zooplanktivore. In other words, its diet is composed of almost exclusively zooplankton. The gizzard shad lives on zooplankton when it's young, and after it hits about 4 inches in size, it shifts to being a detritivore, detritus. So it acts more like a sucker. It's eating all of that organic matter and stuff that's down on the bottom. And you can see it actually has a little bit more like a sucker mouth, an inferior mouth, where this fish has a more terminal mouth on the end of its face like a predator. So keep that in mind. We're actually gonna see where that plays a role later in this talk. The family Catastomidae are the suckers. There are several species of suckers in Lake Texoma. These 4 are all quite abundant. This is a bigmouth buffalo, and this is a smallmouth buffalo. This one is a river carp sucker, which is often mistaken for a carp. It's not. A carp is in an entirely different family. It's in the minnow family, not in the sucker family. And a carp has those barbels or whiskers on its mouth, and you see this one does not. There are several other features that are very different about it as well, but that's kind of the standout, is the absence of those barbels. And this is one of the smaller ones. This is a little spotted sucker. Those guys max out at about 12 or 14 inches long, where these 2 right here, the bigmouth buffalo and smallmouth buffalo, can both reach sizes of around 50 pounds. So very large fish. All of these are detritivores. These are the fish that are eating down there on the bottom that organic matter. Here are some more suckers that are very either rare or extirpated. Extirpated means they're not extinct, but they have been eliminated from that particular system. So a black buffalo, a high fin carp sucker, you can see where it gets its name. This is a golden red horse, and this is a blue sucker. Now, I work mostly in Oklahoma, and I have caught all 4 of these species in other systems, but I've never caught any of these in Lake Texoma. That's not to say that they aren't there, but if they are, they're probably quite rare. Now, I mentioned the minnow family a little while ago. That's the family Cyprinidae. This is actually the largest family in Lake Texoma. In other words, this is the family for which we have the most species occurring. All 4 of these are non-native. This one are, yeah, with this group includes the carps and the minnows. This is a common carp. That fish is very common in Lake Texoma. It's much more golden colored like that, and you see those little barbels down here that it uses for chemoreception. This is a grass carp, not nearly as abundant in Lake Texoma, but there are no shortage of them in Lake Texoma. And then both of these are introduced and are now in the Red River downstream of Lake Texoma, and to date have not been reported in the lake. Let's hope that they don't make it. These things are very, very impactful. You've probably seen videos and photographs of these in other systems. The Ohio River Basin, for example, is just absolutely infested with these things. The numbers get huge. They have a big impact on the system. And as I mentioned, we have found these in the Red River downstream of Lake Texoma. So hopefully they stay there. Actually, hopefully they go away, but they won't. Hopefully they don't make it into Lake Texoma. Then we get into the native minnows, of which there are lots and lots. This is the most abundant family in Texas. In fact, I'm not sure how many species of minnows there are in Texas. I mentioned most of my work is in Oklahoma, and that's where I teach. We actually have 55 different species of minnows in Oklahoma. Quite a few less in Texas, and about 20 species of minnows in Lake Texoma. So as I mentioned before, this is the most abundant family. They use a very wide variety of habitats. Some of them are open water, some of them are cover, some of them are detritivores, some of them are insectivores. So we have some generalists, we have some specialists. A lot of these form large schools of fishes. And when you look at the minnows that live in big rivers, most of them are schooling. And consequently, most of them are very plain and very silver. If you go sample minnows that live in mountain streams, they're not schooling. They tend to be very pretty, very colorful. But when we drag up a bunch of minnows in Lake Texoma, a lot of times it just looks like it's all the same fish until you really start digging into them. So this is how we sample those things with a seine. This picture right here is often what those seine halls look like. Now, I want to point out that the vast majority of fish in this picture are not minnows. They're actually silver sides, which we'll see here in a little bit. But you can see a couple fish in there that look a little bit different. You see that one is different. That one is different. That one's different. That one's different. I know it's hard to tell. Some of them are obviously different, others not so much. Both of those, you see how broad-bodied those two are right there? Those are actually red shiners. And just a few pictures of some of these fishes. This is a red shiner female and a red shiner male. We find those in Lake Texoma, very pretty in these breeding colors of the males. This is a blacktail shiner. You can't tell the males from the females in those. They all look the same. That's a good example of a schooling fish right there. A few more. This is a bullhead minnow. This is an emerald shiner. This is a golden shiner. All of those are quite abundant in Lake Texoma. This is not a minnow. This is in the family Pisciliidae, which are the live bearers. So this actually includes the guppies like you might buy at a pet store. But we have a native one here. It's the western mosquito fish. They give birth to live young. These are very abundant in Lake Texoma, but typically just around the shallow, weedy areas around the edge of the lake. They actually, you can tell the difference in the males and the females on these guys. The females get a lot bigger and the males are smaller and have this really long section of their anal fin ray. And they actually use that to insert the sperm into the female. So most fish are external fertilizers. These are internal fertilizers, hence the live young. I mentioned the silverside a little while ago when you saw that big pail full of fish. We have two species in Lake Texoma. This is an inland silverside. This is a brook silverside. Excuse me. This is one of, if not the most abundant fish in Lake Texoma. I can drag a seine around the perimeter of Lake Texoma, and sometimes we will pull up literally 1,000 of these things in one seine haul. Very, very abundant. You can see that they're kind of translucent. You can sort of see through them. I've heard people call these ghost minnows for that reason. But remember, they're not a minnow. They are in their own unique family. This is the family Atheronopsidae. And there's another one, it's called the brook silverside. This one tends to do better in big rivers. This one in smaller streams. So this one is very, very abundant in Lake Texoma because it's more like a big river. This one is in Lake Texoma, but not particularly abundant. These are also a very important food source for all of the carnivores, all of the piscivores in Lake Texoma, the striped bass, the largemouth bass, they're so abundant that they're a very important food source. Now, I put this picture in there because, again, when you drag a seine and you pull it up, and it looks like they're all the same kind of fish. This is how I have my students learn to start recognizing differences. I make them take those fish and lay them all out facing the same direction and line them up in rows on trays. And when you do that, the differences start popping out. When you look at these fish, you can see that all 6 of these are different. They are all very unique. And so this is a bullhead minnow. This is a golden shiner. This is a red shiner. That's the inland silverside. That's a blacktail shiner. And that's that little mosquito fish. Getting into the family Ictaluridae are the catfishes. We have 5 species of catfish, all of which are very abundant in Lake Texoma. 3 of them are very important sport fish. There's the channel catfish, the flathead catfish, and the blue catfish. Lake Texoma is renowned for its blue catfish. It is literally a world-class blue catfish fishery. And it's starting to get attention for that. I've noticed that we've now started having a lot of catfish tournaments that are attracting people from all over the country to those tournaments. The bullhead's down here, much less desirable as a sport fish, but both of them are present in Lake Texoma. We have a black bullhead and a yellow bullhead, and you can see generally where they get their name. They're very big, thick heads. These tend to be darker in color, these more yellow in color. Sometimes I hear these called mudcats. This is the family Maranidae. This is what Lake Texoma is famous for, which is a striped bass. It's not native to Lake Texoma. It was introduced there as a sport fish. And as with blue cats, Lake Texoma is absolutely a world-class striped bass fishery. This is one that I target. I'm not very good at. It's actually my wife over there with one she caught last year. This is the native fish of Lake Texoma and the Red River. It's the white bass. They don't get nearly as big, and they're much broader top to bottom. And then fish managers figured out how to hybridize these two and come up with what they call the wiper or the white bass striped bass hybrid. Now, why do they do that? Well, you might think, well, why don't we just fish for either of these two, and why bother to mix something? The reason they do that is these will actually grow faster than either of the two parental species. And they're also considered to have a higher catchability rate, more likely to hit a lure. So you can see why that would be attractive. You can grow a lot of fish flesh relatively quickly with these things and catch them. So it is a very popular fish. The black basses are all in the family Centrarchidae. That includes the black bass and the sunfishes. We have 3 black basses in Lake Texoma. We have largemouth, smallmouth, and spotted bass. All 3 of those are very common. All of them are very productive in Lake Texoma. All of them very important sport fish and highly sought after. You know, this fish right here brings a lot of money to our area in the form of fishing tournaments. The sunfishes are also in the family Centrarchidae, same family as those black basses, but a different genus. So the sunfish, when we use that term, it refers to members of the genus Lepomus. Just like we said, the black bass refers to members of the genus Micropterus. Now, sometimes you hear these things called brim. That's acceptable. Sometimes you hear them called perch. That's not acceptable from an ichthyologist perspective. A perch is an entirely different family. Perch are in the family Perchidae. So that's one I don't allow my students to use. They have to call these sunfish. I'll let them get away with brim, but the correct common name is sunfish. These 5 are all very common in Lake Texoma, some more common than others, but all 5 of these can easily be found. This is a green sunfish, has a much more bass-like body, bigger mouth, the blue mask on the face. This is a bluegill, a much broader body, very slab-sided, a little short opercular flap with no white margin around the perimeter and a tiny little mouth. This is a long-ear sunfish. You can see where it gets its name, an exaggeratedly long opercular flap with a white margin around the edge of it. Also a small mouth, slab-sided. A red ear, it's kind of intermediate between this slab side and this more bass-like form. You see how it's kind of in the middle here? And you can see where it gets its name. It has that red margin around the opercular flap. And then this one is called a warmouth. A warmouth is so named because it has a very, very large mouth. It's a very effective predator. It has the body shape of this green sunfish, but you can see it has the dark mask and all these dark blotches on its side. They don't get very big. That's about as big as they get as the one you see in that picture there. These are still in the family Centrarchidae, same family as the bass and the sunfish. The crappies. We have 2 species of crappie in Lake Texoma. We have a black crappie and white crappie. Black crappie tend to be a little bit more broad-sided than the white crappie. They both have dark pigment on their sides and in their fin rays, but you see that on the black crappie, that dark pigment is just scattered, whereas on the white crappie, it forms these vertical bars. And there's also a really accurate meristic, which means something we can count to separate them as well. If you look at the spiny rays on the black crappie, there will be 7 to 8, and on the white crappie, there are 5 or 6. So pretty easy to tell them apart. Both of these very important sport fish and highly sought after in Lake Texoma. Both of them are native. This is kind of a unique critter in Lake Texoma. The family Cyanidae is actually a family that's, like we said, the Clupeidae is mostly a marine family. So if you fish on the coast of Texas for redfish or croakers or black drum or sheep's head, there are a bunch of these members of the family Cyanidae. And again, most of them are marine or coastal. This is called a freshwater drum because it's the only member of that family that exists in fresh water. So you find them throughout the interior of the United States, all the way up the Mississippi River Basin. A very cool looking fish. Probably underappreciated as a sport fish. I think most people would consider this a rough fish. Even though we love to go down to the coast and catch and eat the drum down there. These are a little bit hard to clean, but they are a really good eating fish, actually really good flavor to these fish, and they're quite abundant in Lake Texoma. You see the mouth shape on this guy? This is actually a detritivore. It feeds on the bottom, but it's what we call a selective detritivore. It's not like a sucker that just indiscriminately sucks up everything and tries to pick out the good stuff. This thing is picking through the bottom, but it's looking for just the good stuff, like worms or crayfish or mussels. So very similar to the way a channel catfish and a blue catfish feed. Those are both what we call selective detritivores. Now I mentioned perch are in the family Percidae. Here's that family. So the family Percidae includes two large groups, the perches and the darters. We don't have any native perches here in Texas. The perches, such as a yellow perch, white perch, those are native to northern states, to areas that had glacial lakes. We do have a bunch of darters in our area, and especially as you go east, start getting into the mountains. The Appalachians, for example, are where you really hit the pinnacle of diversity of darters. So the darters are for the most part little stream fishes, very, very colorful. They're built to live on the bottom. They live in and under the rocks. A lot of them are nocturnal and eat insects. Most of them are stream specialists, but there are a couple of generalists, and two of the generalists can be found in Lake Texoma. This is an orange throat darter. There's a male and there's a female. If I find pretty much any kind of rocky habitat around the shores, that's usually where I'll find these guys. And then this one is a log perch, same family, Percidae. It's a darter, different genus than this one. But again, a generalist and similar habitat. I tend to find these guys around rocky areas pretty much anywhere in the lake. I wouldn't call either of these abundant, but I wouldn't call them uncommon either. So that was a quick overview of the fishes. Let's start talking a little bit more now about how fishes are interacting in that environment and how that environment is affecting those fish as well. I put the word up here, trash fish, question mark. I'm sure you've all heard that term before. I despise that term. Rough fish, I can live with that one, but the term trash fish implies that they have no value, might even imply that they are of negative value. And that's really not the case at all. So I want to point out, for example, over here on the left, you see this is a typical food web, and one that is a major food web in Lake Texoma. So we have that detritus down here on the bottom. That's all the leaf litter and organic matter that washes in from the watershed. Anything that dies in the water column sinks to the bottom and becomes detritus. All the algae, all the zooplankton, all the fish become part of that detritus community. And we also have phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is algae. Specifically, it's the algae that's in the water column. Now you'll notice that what these arrows show are the direction of flow of energy. And so zooplankton, for example, eat phytoplankton. What eats zooplankton? Well, threadfin shad eat zooplankton. Those silversides, like I was talking about, eat zooplankton. Gizzard shad will eat zooplankton when they're young, but as I mentioned earlier, they'll switch to detritus when they're older. And then all of these things are feeding that striped bass. So you see how the energy works its way from down here at the bottom up to the higher trophic levels. So this is a typical food web, bottom of the food chain to the top of the food chain. Now here's an example how some of those rough fish can, for example, influence that whole food chain. Here, this is a smallmouth buffalo. A smallmouth buffalo is a detritivore. So it's down here, you see it has that sucker-shaped mouth. It's down on the bottom and it's just foraging around in that detrital layer. That detritus, again, is all that rotting organic matter, leaves and dead algae and everything else that sinks to the bottom. And so in the process, it's actually moving nutrients that are tied up down here in the substrate into the water column. And it does that through two processes. One is just what's called bioturbation. It's just mucking around down here, kind of like a pig. And in the process, it's kicking all of those nutrients up into the water column. Nitrogen and phosphorus, those kinds of things. That can then be taken up by algae. And that algae then feeds the zooplankton feed the little fish feed the big fish. The other mechanism is they release a lot of nitrogen through urination. This is true of all freshwater fishes. The kidney, the osmotic gradient of a fish is such that they're eliminating roughly 1/3 of their body weight in urine every single day. So, you know, imagine if you're a 30-pound fish, you're literally producing about 10 pounds of urine every single day. With that is nitrogen. Nitrogen, again, one of those nutrients that facilitates the growth of algae. The algae feed the zooplankton feed the little fish and on up the food chain. So I would make the argument that a lot of these fish down here are actually part of the sort of an energy pump that helps move nutrients from the bottom of the food chain up here to the higher food chain. Lake Texoma, as I mentioned, is a world-class striped bass fishery, and I don't think we can dismiss the contribution that some of these rough fish make to that whole process. So I got a little ahead of myself here. We were talking about the fish, and the next concept there was energy and food web. So I gave you a little bit of an introduction to that. Let's talk about that a little bit more, and more specifically the energy. Understanding energy is kind of key to understanding ecology. And when we say energy, what are we talking about? Well, there are different forms of energy that any organism can use, or that different organisms can use, I should say. You know, energy can come to us in the form of light energy, chemical energy, and heat energy. Now, if you look at this person or their dog, they're clearly burning energy. And where did they get that energy? Well, obviously they got it from their food. Which of these forms of energy is that? Well, the food that we eat is chemical energy. Carbohydrates, proteins, fats, those are all chemicals. We turn that into energy. So the form of energy that we use is chemical energy. The form of energy that zooplankton and little fish and big fish use is all chemical energy. But ultimately, where did it come from? Well, at some point, we're going to have to extract it from light energy. Anyway, there's a picture of my your plate of dinner, or at least what our plates of dinner are supposed to look like if we're eating healthy. You know, you see carbohydrates, proteins, fats. All of those things are different macronutrients, but all of them are forms of chemical energy. And those are the major groups right here: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. But that's also the major groups that everything else eats: the zooplankton, the little fish, and the big fish. Now, let's get to this again, these two components that I want to point out down here that are at the bottom of the food chain, we said are coming in one of two ways. We have the detritus, and we said that's all of that organic matter. It washes in the watershed from that giant Red River Basin and all the tributaries: leaf litter, grasses, just all sorts of organic matter like that, twigs, sticks. And then we also have the phytoplankton, which is the algae. Now that algae is growing based on the sunlight that's hitting the lake. What about these plants? Where did all of their energy come from? Once again, those also came from sunlight. So ultimately, we're building the base of the food chain here with light energy, and then turning that light energy into a tangible, consumable form. So here's some very simple diagrams to illustrate that. You know, we're eating, when you look at those carbohydrates and those proteins and those fats that we're eating, that the fish are eating, the base of all of those is carbon, right? That's what forms the base of all three of those macronutrients. So where did that carbon come from? Well, this is photosynthesis 101. You guys are all familiar with this. Here's a plant. It's able to take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then turn that into glucose. So it's robbing the carbon. What's it doing with the oxygen? Well, it's getting rid of the oxygen as a waste product. So we took carbon dioxide, we kept the carbon, we built a plant out of it, and we got rid of the oxygen as a waste product. So we've taken this gaseous form of carbon and we've turned it into a solid form. Now we've got something that we can eat. In the water, same process with algae. You see this algae right here is taking up sunlight as light energy. It takes up carbon dioxide as well. It produces some tissue. There's our carbon now. And just like plants, it gets rid of that oxygen as a waste product. And in this case, that oxygen is providing oxygen to the water that those fish all desperately need. So not only is this providing the base of the food chain, this is providing the oxygen that they use to respire. So algae is an extremely important component in any lake system. Now, I also pointed out, or this also points out, what happens when it dies? Well, as we said, it goes down to the bottom. It releases all these various chemicals, starch, oil, cellulose. But again, this becomes part of that detritus community that can also be used as a food component by many species. So we have two sources by which we can get carbon into that lake. We have algae, which is produced in the lake itself. And then we have detritus. Some of that detritus is produced in the lake. Everything that dies sinks. But then a lot of it is produced outside of the lake. All of those rivers and streams are carrying large loads of carbon, leaf litter, detritus, washing it into the lake. So that plays a really important role in the food webs of Lake Texoma. Both of those do, both phytoplankton and detritus. Now what I want to look at next is what I'm calling it spatial dynamics here. In other words, how are parts of the lake different with respect to those food sources, and how does that affect the fish community in general? So we said that whenever we wash detritus into an ecosystem, into a lake, it's going to be down here on the bottom. And anything that lives up here and dies is going to sink to the bottom. But we said that that algae has to grow in the water column in the presence of sunlight. Well, if you look at sunlight penetration in water, it only goes so deep. And eventually, all of that light, as it goes deeper and deeper, becomes absorbed or reflected. We call it attenuated. It gets used up. So this point down here is when the light runs out, is what we call the bottom of the photic zone. Everything above that has enough light for photosynthesis to occur, therefore for algae to grow. Everything below that line is what we call the aphotic zone, meaning there is no more light down there. We're not going to grow any more algae down there. So you see that our algae production really occurs up here in the top of the lake. So up here, we're going to have a lot of algae. Down here, we're going to have detritus. And I got a little bit ahead of myself here, but that's basically positing the same thing here. Since algae production requires light, where would we find algae? Again, it's in those higher layers of water. And since detritus and dead algae sink, we're going to find those on the bottom. So you can begin to see how this is going to start dictating where we might find those various fishes based on what they eat. So, for example, if algae is only in the photic zone, where would we find the zooplankton that eat the algae? Also in the photic zone. Although I would make a point about a neat component of zooplankton ecology is many species of zooplankton will actually migrate down into the dark water during the daytime, and then they migrate up into the top layers at night to graze on that algae. Now, why would they do that? Well, because a lot of fish out there are trying to eat them. All those threadfin shad, gizzard shad, silverside. So it's actually a predation avoidance mechanism. There's still plenty of algae for those critters to, or I should say zooplankton for those critters to eat. But this is where they're taking up those nutrients in the photic zone. That means that where would we find the zooplanktivores? Well, in the daytime, they're up here feeding on the zooplanktivores where there's light. And at night, they're down here feeding on them when those zooplankton move into that aphotic zone. Not as effectively, because most of those are actually sight feeders, but they can still take a few. And then when we start thinking about those detritivores, like those suckers and catfish, where are they feeding? Well, obviously down here where the detritus is. So that's, I said, spatial dynamics. So that kind of helps us understand the spatial dynamics in this dimension, in that vertical dimension. So we can refer to vertical zonation and understand how fish become distributed within a vertical zone. This one is a little bit different. This one is looking at longitudinal zones. Longitudinal zones basically are referring from up lake to down lake. This is actually some concepts that as lake ecologists, we've stolen from the stream ecologists. So stream ecologists describe how stream system change from upstream to downstream. So if you were to take any given stream, look at where it begins up in the foothills and it's very small. Look at where it ends up down in the floodplain and it's large and wide, muddy. There are a lot of changes, ecological changes that take place along that longitudinal gradient, including how the species change along the gradient. And we've stolen that concept from the stream ecologist and tried to apply it to lakes. And it's not quite as strong a connection, but we see many of the same patterns. So if you look at Lake Texoma, we have two primary longitudinal gradients, from upstream to downstream on the Red River arm, and from upstream to downstream on the Washita River arm. Then you see, we could also see those patterns even within individual coves. Like this is Little Glasses Cove, for example, Little Glasses Creek. And so this is the up lake part of the cove. This is the down lake part of the cove. This one, you can see, I forgot the name of that one. Doesn't matter. Anyway, you can see that every one of these coves, here's Buncombe Creek right here. Here's Big Mineral right here. So the fish community and the ecology up here is quite different than it is by the time you get way down here. So what are some of the patterns that we tend to see there along that longitudinal gradient? Well, first of all, we have to name them. It's one of the things that we as scientists do. We try to classify and name things. That helps us understand them better. So if you take a lake like Texoma, this is where the water's running in the Red River. This is what we call the riverine zone. We call it that because it looks and behaves much like a river. It's narrower, it's shallower, it's muddier, and so on and so forth. And down here at this end, we call it the lacustrine zone. Lacustrine literally translates to lake-like. So down here, it's much more open water. It's deeper and very different in many respects. And then here in the middle, we refer to that as the transitional zone. It's where we kind of see these two zones come together. Now, what are the characteristics of these things? Riverine zones like this are way up lake. The water tends to be moving through pretty fast because it's narrower and the river's running in. It's shallower and narrower. So it tends to be very shallow. It tends to be quite muddy. The water is not clear at all because it's coming from that Red River. It tends to be carrying very large loads of that detritus that we were talking about, all that leaf litter and such. Because there's not very much, because it's very muddy, there's not very much sunlight penetration. And if there's not very much sunlight penetration, we're not going to see a lot of phytoplankton, that algae, and we're not going to see a lot of zooplankton, the stuff that eats that algae. Consequently, what's the fish community going to look like? Well, it's for the most part is dominated by detritivores. We're going to find a lot of suckers and catfish and drum and gizzard shad at this end of the lake. That doesn't mean that's all we're going to find, but that is what's going to dominate the community. Now we get down here to the lacustrine zone. What are its characteristics? This is way down lake. It's very wide, it's very deep, so consequently the flow through is not nearly as noticeable. It's not fast water. It's more lake-like, less river-like. It's very deep. Not much detritus makes it down there. Most of the detritus that washes in here gets broken down and rotted before it ever makes it all the way to the dam. So the only detritus we have down here is whatever sinks. Most of the muddiness has settled out. If you've ever paid much attention to Lake Texoma, this end will be muddy. Down here by the dam will be clear. Only when we get really big muddy rains does it ever become muddy down here towards the dam. That means that we have a lot of light penetration. Therefore, we can grow a lot of algae, that phytoplankton. We can grow a lot of zooplankton. And then all that food chain that relies on that zooplankton. So the zooplanktivores, things like silversides and threadfin shad that can feed those striped bass. Now, what does that leave for the transitional zone? Well, the transitional zone is kind of intermediate in characteristics. In Lake Texoma, that transitional zone tends to occur right about here. By the time you get downstream from the islands, if you're familiar with it, it's very lacustrine and the community is very lacustrine-like. Everything above Highway 70 bridge, highway, what highway is that? 377, the Willis Bridge, is very riverine. And we see all those characteristics of that riverine system. And then roughly this area right here from the Willis Bridge down to the islands is where we see most of those changes take place. Now, one of the things that results from that is that this is usually the most diverse area with respect to fishes right here. Why is that? Well, it's because we have a lot of riverine fish and we have a lot of lacustrine fish. So we tend to find both in here. Again, that's not to say that we won't find riverine fish in the lacustrine section and vice versa. We find them all over the lake, but it's those relative proportions that tend to be fairly predictable based on where we're looking in the lake. And you can see that it comes down to the energy dynamics. Is it getting its energy from that detritus, or is it getting its energy from sunlight and phytoplankton? I've got a few slides to illustrate that. This is a food web. I meant to put the credit of the student that did this work. Is one of my students from several years. His name is Tim Birdsong. And Tim Birdsong is now fairly high up with Texas Parks and Wildlife. He's one of their program coordinators out of the Austin office. He did this as a student project. So he had a sample size of 57 fish from the riverine section. And he cut their stomachs open and did a food analysis. And so this is one of those food webs. So this is showing how we start down here at the bottom with all that detritus on the bottom, and the arrows are showing the direction that it goes. So you see that he had this feeding a bunch of things. It's feeding there's a common carp, catfish, drum. We got a blue catfish here. We got a channel cat here. We've got a buffalo here. And then you notice that that feeds things like the zooplankton. He found zooplankton in the drum. It feeds things like these shad. He found those shad inside the stomachs of the crappie and the gar. But you can see that it's really dominated by those detritivores: carp, buffalo, drum, and 2 species of catfish and gizzard shad. Now you move down towards the dam. We said it would be more lacustrine habitat. What's the fish community look like? Well, you notice that same thing right here. We have detritus. What's it feeding? In this case, really just that channel catfish is probably feeding that drum as well, and that gizzard shad. But then you see who else pops up here. Now we have white bass and striped bass. Not nearly as much diversity, and our community was actually dominated more by these piscivores when we get downstream and less by those detritivores. Oh, here's our little silverside. This is an important zooplanktivore. And again, we really need that algae component, that sunlight, to grow algae, and that grows those silversides. And then those silversides can feed a lot of those piscivores. And then this is the food web from that transitional area. The first thing that you notice here, you remember I said that's often where we see the greatest number of species, because if you look at our hit list here, we now see species from both of the previous two lists. We have all the detritivores that we saw before: carp, buffalo, blue cat, channel cat, drum, plus we're adding in those piscivores as well. Here's our white bass and our striped bass up here. So again, it's really the relative numbers that change, but this is usually where we see the greatest amount of fish diversity. So just a couple slides here then to kind of wrap things up. You know, you look at a big lake ecosystem like Texoma, and it can seem like it's very mysterious. Well, before I moved here to Denison, I lived just outside of Durant and was really good friends with one of my neighbors there. And he would say things every once in a while, like I don't know how many times I heard him say, "That lake is amazing. There's no telling what all's down there." And my argument to him was, that's not true. There is telling what is down there. We have a really darn good idea of what's down there through studying that ecosystem. A lake, a reservoir, it's an ecosystem. All the ecosystems tend to follow the same general principles. Understanding energy flow is where I like to start any ecosystem. I think it provides a good overview, a really broad level of understanding an ecosystem when you look at that energy flow. It's not particularly mysterious. Science has answered many of the questions that describe what's going on in Lake Texoma and lakes just like it. And again, that greater understanding leads to our ability to make more informed decisions, more effective conservation, wiser use of that resource, and a greater appreciation of that resource. And I mentioned that Lake Texoma is very near and dear to my heart for a number of reasons, and continues to be, from a research and from a recreation perspective. But despite all that, I'm still not a very good fisherman. All right, that's what I have. I meant to bring a clock or something with me, and I didn't. I'm not sure how much time I used there, but how long was that? Microphone?
About an hour and 15 minutes. And, but that's good. If anybody has questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them, or you can type them in the chat, either way. Excellent program, Tim. I enjoyed it and learned a fair amount.
Well, thank you. I should have brought that clock with me and I could have streamlined it a little bit there, but it seemed like 30 minutes. Okay.
Pam is asking about water pollution and its effect on Lake Texoma.
Anything specifically or just general?
In general, her question is pretty general.
Okay, so pollution is a pretty broad term. You know, kind of depends on what we classify as pollution. So we can talk about chemical pollutants, organic pollutants, even sediment is classified as a pollutant based on things like EPA. The biggest threats with respect to pollution in Lake Texoma are sediment. We get a huge amount of sediment. If you look at what most of the watershed of Lake Texoma is, it's agricultural lands. and very poorly managed agricultural lands. They're plowed right to the edge of the rivers, no buffer zones. It's why we saw like those images there, the Ouachita River, where Lake Texoma is accumulating huge amount of sediments. Sediment is the biggest pollution issue that we have in Lake Texoma. A little bit of threat to in terms of chemical pollutants, specifically from oil and gas development. We've seen a lot of that, fracking and those kind of activities that take place. We even have oil and gas wells right on the lake. There's always the potential for spills, both the point source and non-point source chemicals coming into the lake. All of that said, Lake Texoma is relatively clean. We don't have, for example, any fish consumption advisories like we do in a lot of systems.
What's the expected lifespan of Texoma with the sedimentation going on?
You know, nobody knows. That's a difficult one. I'm really surprised that I haven't seen some numbers on it. It's beyond my determination, I can assure you. Whether or not the Corps has a projection, I've never seen one. I suspect that somewhere somebody has one. But the hard part there is kind of defining, you know, what do we define as a lifespan? If we define lifespan as the point that it's full of sediment all the way to the dam, you know, when they built Lake Texoma, my understanding was they said they expect Lake Texoma to last 100 years. It was built in the late 40s. So we're what, 60 years into it now. We have much more than 40 years left in Lake Texoma. I think that was a very conservative estimate. And again, when we start looking at that, what do we call usable or lifespan? You know, if the lake is half full of sediment, is it still a lake? Well, yeah, it's still a lake. It's still going to provide a lot of function. One of the things that I teased out when I was doing that sediment work up on the Ouachita Arm was we see lots and lots of fragmentation, shallow water, more slough-like habitats. It impacted the fish community, but you know who loves it? Shorebirds, waterfowl, wildlife. So I like to look at it as kind of a glass half full scenario, where as it starts becoming full of sediment, it's just changing to another form of habitat. You know, in ecology, we call that ecological succession. That was a really long answer to say, I don't know, and I don't know if anybody else knows, but I suspect it's in the more than 100 years range.
Okay, Tim, Elizabeth is asking a question about the food web. She says, I'm a little confused how the insects feed catfish. I thought catfish were solely bottom feeders.
So they, a couple things. One is they're not 100% bottom feeders. They are, again, one of those fish that we classify as a selective detritivore. So they're spending most of their time picking organisms off of the bottom, but then they'll also spend their time feeding in the water column. You know, if you do much fishing, you'll know that occasionally you'll catch a catfish on a spinner. I've even caught catfish on top waters. Most of the time is on the bottom. That said, I probably should have made a clarification. When we talk about insects, Tim Birdsong put a picture of a grasshopper. That's a terrestrial insect. But the bottom of Lake Texoma is absolutely covered with aquatic insect larvae, stoneflies and mayflies and dragonflies, those kinds of things. Those are insects. And so the majority of what is found in them in terms of insect biomass is aquatic insect biomass, not grasshoppers. It's a little
it's a good clarification. Elizabeth also asked if you're aware of any dredging that's going on in Lake Texoma.
I'm not. You know, when I was doing that sediment work, I actually almost put that slide in this show right here to explain the problem with that. I know that's always the first thing we think of is, well, can we just dredge it and get rid of it? I actually did some calculations on that based on one small part of the lake. If you're familiar with Tishomingo National Wildlife Refuge. And the big body of water on it is called the Cumberland Pool. And I came up with an estimate, a ballpark estimate based on original water depths and current water depths in Cumberland Pool. And then calculated how much sediment that was in terms of volume. And then extrapolated that to, if we were to run a dump trucks full of that sediment out of there at the rate of one dump truck, a 10 cubic yard dump truck, standard dump truck load, one every minute, 8 hours a day, it would take 8 years to return it to what it was. And that's not even counting the sediment accumulation that we accrued during that 8 years. The volume of sediment there is kind of unfathomable. Effectively, I think it would take a full-time effort, probably a rail system to get it out of there. And then you have the problem with, what do you do with it? Dump it in somebody else's watershed? Nobody wants that stuff. So I don't think that dredging is by any stretch a feasible approach at a large scale. That said, small scale dredging, for example, can we make sure that Cumberland Cove stays attached to the rest of the lake with a little channel? Small scale dredging might be some way that we can maintain some connectivity, but no, we can't get rid of all of that stuff.
Okay. Also seeing several kudos here about your presentation, how good it was. So, and I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat. Let me just say thanks again, Tim. This was a great program and very informative. And I'm going to see if I can't get on the list to sign up to hear your talk about the fishes with the master naturalist there in Blue Stem chapter. So thanks again, Tim. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close down the meeting. Thanks everyone for attending today.
I echo that. Thanks for attending.